Badfinger were not a band that failed because the songs were not good enough. They did not fall apart because the audiences stopped caring. They did not even collapse because the records stopped selling. They were destroyed by paperwork, by signatures, by trust placed in the wrong hands, and by a deal that looked like salvation until it became a trap. If you were writing a documentary about how the music business can eat a band alive, you could not invent a cleaner example. A group signed by the Beatles, hit singles, world-class melodies, a catalogue that never really went away. And yet, when the time came for the money to land where it was meant to land, it did not arrive. It vanished into accounts and companies and silence. This is the story of how Badfinger went from the first non-Beatles act on Apple to a legal hostage situation, and how the record deal that was meant to make them rich instead helped drive them into ruin. Badfinger began as the Ivies, a hard-working Welsh group with sharp harmonies and a natural gift for pop songwriting. They were young, hungry and serious about the craft. They moved through the same London ecosystem that had produced countless hopefuls: clubs, demos, auditions, long waits, small wins, and then the occasional door opening. The door that opened for them was Apple Records.
The group began to gain a reputation. Some critics saw them as the new Beatles, an image they played on in their promotional pictures. Their links with the Beatles didn't end there. Paul McCartney wrote their first hit. Another Beatle was their guiding influence, George Harrison. They joined the Beatles' Apple organization. Harrison helped make the deal.
On the 23rd of July, 1968, the Ivies became the first non-Beatles recording artists signed to Apple. That fact alone shaped how the world saw them.
And you guys were dubbed the next Beatles.
Yeah, the new Beatles. This is what the Beatles would sound like if they got this together. That's what they wrote about us, man.
Apple was still new, still glowing with the idea that it would be different, still carrying the aura of the Beatles at their creative peak. Being signed there was not just a business move, it was an identity. It came with benefits that most young bands could not even imagine. The Beatles circle was close enough to touch. Mal Evans took an interest. Apple had access, visibility, and a certain magic that made journalists and fans look twice. But it also came with problems that were not obvious at first. Apple was not a normal label. It was a dream run like a company. People arrived with ideals and left with headaches. Money moved in confusing ways. Decisions were made for reasons that were not always musical. And as the Beatles themselves drifted apart, Apple became a place where the lights stayed on but the foundations cracked. Still, in the beginning, it felt like a fairy tale. The band recorded, released music, and began to build a profile. They were talented enough to justify the attention. They were not just lucky, they could write.
Where did the thing Badfinger come along all of a sudden?
Well, it came from that's the break that Paul gave us, writing the single, Come and Get It.
Yeah.
And Ivies was like, it'd been, we did it with the other thing, and it wasn't successful, and besides that, it was a bit insipid as a name, you gotta be dirty these days, right? You gotta sound growth on your face and, look a bit dirty as if you're gonna,
So who gave you the name Badfinger?
Well, a lot of names were coming out, and someone said Badfinger, and everyone laughed.
But here's a group with so much talent and originality, they've established their own identity. They've come into their own as one of the world's top groups today. Ladies and gentlemen, Badfinger.
Badfinger, now renamed, were handed something most bands never receive: a hit song from Paul McCartney. Come and Get It was not simply a gift. It was also a test. The instruction was clear: record it exactly, do not change it, do not get clever.
So one night I kind of was in bed and I couldn't go to sleep, so just ran downstairs and had this little idea and did the rough idea for Come and Get It. And then we were set up to make a Beatles album. Can't remember which one it was. We were set up. So we were all in the studio. The drums were mic'd. Everything was mic'd for the next day, on the album. So I just ran in, because I lived real near the studio. So I just ran in. And Phil McDonald was the engineer. I said, Phil, everyone's going to get here in half an hour. I said, look, just before they get here, I want to do a quick demo. I said, I know exactly what I want to do. Get the mics. Go now. Get it. Drums first. And I kind of knew how it worked. Like piano, dun 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 dun, the bass, dun dun dun. If you want it, here it is. Harmony, come and get it. And Phil, he nearly had a heart attack, but we in about half an hour, I think, we made that demo. Then I said to Badfinger, I said, now it's got to be exactly like this. And they were kind of, young band. They said, well, no, we're going to do it a little bit different. We're going to get our own thing, Welsh boys. I said, no. I said, do the rest of the album like that. But this is going to be exactly like this, because this is the hit. And in the end they did. Oh, all right.
If you want it, here it is. Come and get it.
It became a major hit, and it established the band in the public mind as Beatles adjacent.
So Come and Get It came out, and that really launched you. Plus you got the thing in the movie.
And that never-ending journey.
That label helped and hurt them. It helped because it brought listeners in fast. It hurt because it framed them as inheritors rather than innovators, as a supporting act in a larger story. But for a young band chasing security, it was a small price to pay. Hits followed, no matter what, day after day, Baby Blue. The songs were tight, melodic, emotionally direct, and built for radio without feeling like factory work.
There was a lot more acceptance of the band in America for some reason.
You don't have a personal theory on why that was?
Maybe because they thought in England that we were copying the Beatles or something.
Yeah.
In America they seem to, of course a couple of people said that about us in America, but the majority of the writers and stuff were saying very complimentary things about Badfinger and about us being our own, individual selves, and so maybe they were just a bit more open-minded about it.
The albums began to stack up. The band toured, the reputation grew. From the outside, they were on the path every band wants. From the inside, a quieter reality was taking shape. The money did not match the success. There is a specific kind of fear that comes when your record is everywhere, but your fridge is empty. Badfinger were not living like stars. They were working constantly, yet scraping by. Royalties were slow, explanations were vague, and Apple was not built for clarity. Some of that is normal in the business, especially in that era. Recording costs, touring costs, management commissions, publishing splits, and label accounting could take a healthy gross and turn it into thin personal income. But with Badfinger, the gap between what they were achieving and what they were receiving felt extreme. That gap created vulnerability. When a band feels uncertain, it becomes easier for someone to arrive with a promise. I will fix this, I will handle it, I will get you what you are owed. That someone was Stan Polly. Stan Polly presented himself as a professional solution to a band that needed structure. He had American confidence, business language, and the ability to make a musician feel safe by removing complexity from the conversation. To understand why Badfinger fell for him, you have to understand the context. They were not financial experts. They were young men who had moved quickly from club gigs to major label releases. Their focus was the next session, the next single, the next tour, the next arrangement. They were surrounded by legends, and legends often made the business side look like a dull detail that someone else takes care of. Polly stepped into that role. He pushed for control, he pushed for contracts, he pushed for a corporate structure. He created a company that would sit between the band and the money. The band signed. They did not fully understand what they were signing. This is the first key point for a documentary.
They signed up with a New York-based manager, Stan Polly, and formed an American company, Badfinger Enterprises Incorporated. Stan Polly was listed as the company's president. For this period, whatever the group earned in the United States went not to the members of Badfinger, but to the American company. There were promises of some very rich pickings.
Badfinger were not destroyed by one signature. They were destroyed by a chain of signatures that seemed harmless at the time. Polly did not have to steal everything in one night. He only had to get access. By the early 70s, Apple was no longer the same bright promise. The Beatles were fractured. The company was full of internal battles and legal noise. Decisions slowed. Promotion weakened. The sense of purpose faded. For Badfinger, that mattered. A band at their level needed consistent label support, not just a famous logo. They needed singles pushed, albums marketed, tours supported, and opportunities managed. Apple was not reliably delivering that. So Polly offered the next big solution, a new record deal. Warner Brothers was a major label with real infrastructure. It had the power to break artists internationally. It had money, it had credibility. It looked like a step up, and in many ways, it was. But the deal did not come to the band in clear, honest terms. It came through Polly, wrapped in excitement and big numbers. The pitch was simple. You are all going to be millionaires. The Warner contract was presented as enormous. It was described as multi-million. It was described as a new era. It was described as freedom from Apple chaos. The reality was more complicated. Record deals of that size are rarely just gifts. They are usually a system of advances tied to delivery obligations. The money comes in tranches linked to albums delivered, and it is often routed through management structures. With Badfinger, the deal involved a schedule that demanded constant output. A new album roughly every 6 months. That is not just pressure, that is a treadmill. If you fall, the belt keeps moving. The deal also involved advances, and advances were where the trap tightened. An advance is not a prize, it is a loan against future earnings. The label pays now, then recoups later from royalties. If your album sells, fine. If it does not sell enough, the advance becomes a debt that delays profits indefinitely.
Becoming millionaires seemed to be just around the corner. Superstardom beckoned when they were offered a multi-million-dollar recording contract with Warner Brothers. The initial down payment was $500,000. Stan Polly negotiated the deal and explained it to Bill Collins.
Took me all around New York in a big limo, and he said, it's no good you let him read this contract, but it's 3 inches thick. But he said, basically, you've got to understand, and he talked and drummed into my mind that we had a $3 million deal to make 6 albums in 3 years. And don't forget, that is 15 years ago. That was... And Polly was very pleased, of course. Common sense, wasn't it? And
this was all worked out in the back of a limousine in New York City?
Yeah, riding around in the dark. And he was speaking from memory all the time, you know. And I've got copies of the Warner deal contract, but he said, it's no good you trying to read through the legalese. I'll explain it in ordinary language.
Badfinger were told the headline number. They were not trained to hear the fine print. And most critically, the advances were handled through the corporate entity Polly controlled. This is the core mechanism of destruction. When the money landed, it landed in a place the band could not see. Warner had concerns. They wanted safeguards. One key safeguard was an escrow arrangement, money that should be placed somewhere accessible under agreed conditions. On paper, this was meant to protect everyone. It was meant to ensure funds were accounted for and available as required. In practice, it became the fuse. Warner began asking questions about the location and status of the escrow funds. Polly did not provide clear answers. The questions became demands. The demands became warnings. The warnings became formal action. From the band perspective, this would have felt surreal. They were making records, touring, writing, rehearsing, and trying to move forward. Suddenly, they were being told that a large amount of money connected to their deal could not be located in the way it was supposed to be. It was not simply a dispute, it was an alarm bell. And once that bell rang inside a major label, the machine moved quickly, because labels protect themselves first. Warner Publishing terminated its relationship with the Badfinger side of the deal. Legal steps followed, trust collapsed. The band were caught between a label that was now hostile and a manager who controlled the structure that the label no longer trusted. In other words, Badfinger were trapped. In the middle of this chaos, Badfinger recorded "Wish You Were Here." If you want a cruel irony for a documentary, this is it. They made one of their strongest albums at the exact moment their business world was falling apart. It was recorded with care, with ambition, with a sense of craft that proved they were not just a Beatles shadow act. It had depth, it had bite, it had melancholy. It sounded like a band growing up.
You may say it's not a great romance. All I want from you is just a chance to try.
The album was released on the 15th of November 1974. It did not get the chance it deserved. Within weeks, the album was withdrawn from record stores. Promotion stopped, distribution stopped, the record effectively vanished. And when a record vanishes at the moment, it should be building momentum. It does not just lose sales, it loses a future. Badfinger were now a band on a major label, with a major label lawsuit hanging over them, and with a manager at the centre of the dispute. Their name became toxic in the business sense. People around the industry could not be sure who had authority, who owned what, who could sign what, who would sue whom. This is how bands die without any dramatic stage collapse. The phones stop ringing, the bookings disappear, the label stops calling, the money stops arriving. You still exist, but the system that allows you to live as a band has turned you off. As the legal and financial pressures rose, the band began to fracture internally. This is another documentary truth. Even when the villain is outside the band, the damage often lands inside it. Different members reacted differently. Some wanted to fight, some wanted to get away, some wanted to believe the manager could still fix it. When a band is under stress, every small disagreement becomes loaded. Every meeting becomes a test of loyalty. Every decision becomes an argument about survival. At one point, Pete Ham briefly left. He returned partly because the label still wanted the classic lineup, and partly because leaving did not solve the underlying trap. Joey Molland eventually left for good in that period, seeing no clear path through the chaos. This was no longer a story about making music. It was a story about escape. Here is where the treadmill of the Warner deal becomes crucial. Even with the dispute escalating, the obligation to deliver products still existed in the contract logic. Polly pressed the band to keep recording. The band, desperate for a way out or a way forward, went into the studio to cut another album quickly. This work would later be known as Head First. It was recorded under pressure, with time against them, with money uncertain, and with the sense that they were working to satisfy a contract rather than to build a career.
Don't get uptight, say it's alright when the day is dawning.
In a healthier world, the next album would have been a chance to respond creatively to the disappointment of Wish You Were Here being withdrawn. In their world, it became something closer to evidence, a document that showed they were still delivering. Warner, already deep into legal conflict, did not accept it. The suspicion was that the recordings were part of a plan to trigger more advances. Whether or not the band themselves understood it in those terms, the result was the same. The record did not open a door. It slammed one. Now Badfinger were truly stuck. They could not move forward with Warner. They could not easily go elsewhere. They were still tied to Polly, and the band members still had lives to pay for. There is a moment in this story that is easy to miss if you only look at headlines about lawsuits and contracts. It is the human moment where ordinary bills arrive and cannot be paid. By early 1975, Badfinger were financially desperate. Payments did not clear. Checks did not arrive. The band could not confidently book shows because promoters feared legal trouble. They could not easily sign new deals because their status was not clean. They could not even trust that a record sold today would pay them tomorrow. Polly was increasingly unreachable. That detail matters. If you are telling this story in a documentary, you show the unanswered calls, the closed office door, the silence, a band with a global profile unable to get their own manager on the phone. When a band cannot access information about its own money, panic sets in. Panic turns into anger. Anger turns into exhaustion. Exhaustion becomes despair. Pete Ham was at the centre of that despair. Pete Ham was not just a member of Badfinger. He was the main creative engine, the voice that carried their most vulnerable lines, the person who seemed to hold the band together through sheer belief in the music.
Pete and Tommy could sing like birds. Yeah. You know, I was a bit of a warbler, you know, like a frog in the bushes. Those guys could really sing, but I had a good ear for a third part. You know what I mean? So it worked for me.
He was also, by 1975, under enormous pressure. He had responsibilities outside the band. He had a home, he had a partner, he had a baby on the way.
He was, I mean, they talked about money problem. Pete talked about money problem because his girlfriend was pregnant and he wanted to give her a good life. He wanted to bring his child up, you know, quite comfortable. But he didn't have any money. So he was quite depressed, but I didn't think he was that depressed. But then he kept things to himself, really.
There were signs of mental strain. Friends noticed it. Bandmates remembered it. Ham was not simply stressed, he was unravelling. And when someone is unravelling, financial betrayal does not land as a problem to solve. It lands as proof that nothing is safe. On the 23rd of April 1975, Ham learned that the remaining money had effectively disappeared. The details vary in retelling, but the essential point is constant. He believed there was nothing left and no way out. That night he drank with Tom Evans. It was not a celebration. It was the kind of drinking that happens when people have run out of language. In the early hours of the 24th of April, 1975, Pete Ham died by suicide.
In 1975, the pressures became too great for Peter Ham. Early on the morning of April the 24th, He was found hanged in the garage he'd converted into a workroom. He shared the house in Surrey with Anne and her son Blair. Peter Ham was 27.
In his final note, he blamed Stan Polly. The wording has been repeated for decades, not because it is sensational, but because it is direct, plain, and final.
He left a note saying, I hope, I can take that bastard Polly with me. That's what he wrote in his notes. And I don't mean to swear, folks, and use to talk like that, but that's the reality of that. It was sad, you know.
It is the moment where the business story becomes a death story. And the most heartbreaking detail of all is that his daughter was born about a month later.
Peter Ham's widow and Petera, the daughter he's never seen, live today in Scotland. She's almost a look-alike for her father. After Peter died, Anne moved back to her family to work in a Glasgow hairdressing business.
When a musician dies, people imagine the world stops. In reality, the machinery keeps moving. Warner ended the contract. Badfinger dissolved. Apple deleted their albums from its catalogue. The music did not disappear completely, but in the commercial sense, it faded. The band became a cautionary tale told quietly by people in the industry. But the lawsuit did not vanish. The legal conflict continued. The money remained tied up. The paperwork kept grinding. And the surviving members were left with grief and anger, plus the practical reality that they still needed to live. Joey Molland took other work. Mike Gibbons stepped back from the spotlight. Tom Evans struggled to rebuild and to understand how a band that had sold millions could be broke. This is the second key point for your documentary. The tragedy was not only the death. The tragedy was that the band could not even fully mourn because survival demanded immediate attention. Tom Evans lived with what happened to Pete Ham. They had written Without You together, a song that would later generate enormous value for the world, even as the men who wrote it suffered. Evans tried to keep going. He and Molland would eventually reconnect. Versions of Badfinger returned in different forms. Records were made, tours happened. But the spirit of the band was damaged and the business problems never fully released their grip. In the background, the song Without You kept rising. Harry Nilsson turned it into a global hit. Later, it would become a massive hit again in the 90s.
No, I can't forget tomorrow when I think of all my sorrow.
Money flowed around that song. Rights, publishing, royalties, splits, arguments, bitterness. Even in the best circumstances, that kind of money can damage relationships. In the Badfinger circumstances, it was explosive. On the 18th of November 1983, Tom Evans argued with Joey Molland in a heated phone call, reportedly about money connected to Without You.
Tommy and I did have a serious argument the day before, but it was about the money that was being held by the courts in London. And the courts wanted the Badfinger band to agree on how the money should be divided. And there were certain things that Tommy agreed with and certain things he didn't. And so I said, Tommy, we can't get the money until we agree. And he knew the deal as well as I knew the deal, between the band. He knew what it was.
On the 19th of November 1983, Tom Evans died by suicide. Another hanging. Another life ended with business stress as part of the fuel.
Tommy Evans, co-writer of numerous huge hits, was found hanged in the garden of his Surrey home in November 1983. He was 35.
Another chapter that makes the Badfinger story feel like it is cursed, when it is actually something more common and more frightening. A band without protection.
The dispute right now is with Mariana, Tommy's widow, and she...
What's her reasoning behind her theory? What's her reasoning behind that? I mean...
Well, she is convinced that that particular song doesn't come into the agreement. Because she's confused because Nielsen had the big hit with it.
Yeah.
And then Mariah Carey had the big hit with it. And I don't know if she's confused by that. And that's just basically what's going on with it. I have no idea. She's going around saying things about us. She's going on English television saying things about us. Saying that I argued with Tommy about this, which is absolute crap. My only thing that I ever talked to Tommy about these royalties were Tommy, whatever the papers say and whatever the agreement is, that's, I'll go along with it. If without you's not a part of the agreement, then, that's fine.
Yeah.
And that's all I could say about it. There was nothing to argue about.
A viewer might ask a fair question. Why did they not just fire Polly? Because the contracts made it extremely difficult. Management agreements can include clauses that extend terms, lock in commissions, assign rights, and create penalties for early exit. When a manager also controls the corporate entity receiving your money, you have a deeper problem. Even if you walk away emotionally, you are still tied legally. Also, in that era, bands often feared being seen as trouble. If a band is in a legal fight with its manager and a major label, promoters and labels may avoid them, not because they are morally wrong, but because it is complicated. Badfinger became complicated. Complicated is poison in a business that wants clean rights, clear signatures, and predictable risk. So they stayed in the trap longer than anyone should because the trap was built to make leaving feel impossible. Badfinger music often carries a particular emotional tone: yearning, tenderness, melancholy, and a kind of quiet ache. Even their brighter tracks have an edge of sadness. That is not unique in pop, but it feels unusually sincere in their case. After the story of their downfall became widely known, those songs took on a darker weight. Without You is the most obvious example, simply because of its title and its refrain, but it is not the only one. Listen to the albums and you can hear a band that understood vulnerability even before their world collapsed. That makes the business story feel even more brutal. You do not want to romanticize it. You do not want to turn tragedy into a myth. But you also cannot ignore the emotional truth that this was a band built on feeling, and the industry treated them like a line item. Every documentary needs its uncomfortable ending. In this case, it is the fact that Stan Polly did not face meaningful consequences for what happened to Badfinger. There were legal actions, settlements, and financial outcomes that made headlines in specialist circles. But the simple public truth is this: the people who suffered the worst consequences were the musicians, not the man who engineered the structure. Polly lived on, the band members died, the songs continued to earn, the story became a warning. Badfinger had the golden ticket early. They were signed to Apple by the Beatles circle. They had songs written by McCartney in their catalogue. They worked with George Harrison. They had hits. They had albums that critics still praise. If a band like that can be financially destroyed, anyone can. That is why this story matters, beyond the tragedy. It is not only about a bad manager, it is about how common it was, and still can be, for artists to sign away control because they are focused on the art and because the business is designed to be confusing. Badfinger deserved a normal career. They deserved ups and downs, lineup changes, evolving sounds, comebacks, and late-era reassessments that come with age. Instead, they became a lesson. And yet, the music remains. That is the final contradiction. Badfinger were destroyed by a record deal, but they were not erased by it. Their songs outlived the contract. Badfinger weren't the only band ripped off by their manager. If you want to see what happens when the record label is owned by the mob, or what happens when a record label decides to create a fake band because the real one is already broken up, click the thumbnail on screen.